Some people tend to associate the term queer platonic relationship with being a very core or long-term partnership that is non-romantic, and while alterous attraction tends to include more casual forms of attraction. Of course, as you'll see from all the internet debates, that's not always true. And, just like romantic and sexual and platonic relationships can have a wide range of enmeshment and commitment, so can queer platonic relationships and alterous ones as well. And both of these concepts are very much connected to a lot of the concepts that are attached to relationship anarchy, where the terms of a relationship are decided by the people involved based on the specifics of what those people need and their connection, rather than taking on a whole set of expectations and limitations by default, like we do when we fall into these default categories of like, oh, we're going to call this a romantic relationship or we're going to call this a platonic relationship.
Welcome to the Multi-Amory Podcast. I'm Jace.
I'm Emily.
And I'm Dedeker.
We believe in looking to the future of relationships, not maintaining the status quo of the past.
So whether you're monogamous, polyamorous, swinging, casually dating, or if you just do relationships differently, we see you, and we're here for you.
On this episode of the Multi-Amory Podcast, we're not talking about romantic relationships. And we're not talking about platonic relationships. Or maybe we're kind of talking about both of them. Today, we're talking about alterous relationships and queer platonic relationships. Both of these terms are relatively new, showing up just within the past decade or so, but they have been spreading because they fill an important gap in our language about attraction and relationships. So have we used these terms before? Have you heard them before? What are your relationship to these relationship terms?
Until this episode, I'd never heard the term alterous relationships.
Me neither.
Definitely queer platonic relationships for sure. For sure.
Yes.
No problem. Super comfortable. Use that word all the time. Only semi-joking.
Love it.
Have used the word. Am familiar with the word. To answer your question, yes.
Mm-hmm. But alterous, I'd never heard before. I didn't know that was the thing. I was like, what are we talking about here?
Yeah, I had heard it, but I didn't really know what it was about or what it meant. And I was like, I don't know if this applies to me. I don't know. But in learning about it, I'm actually have come to realize, this is a really cool thing and a really useful term and a useful concept because it does really fill a gap that's missing in terms of our language and how we talk about love and attraction and relationships. But if we're going to talk about some terms that are specifically not romantic or platonic, we're actually going to start by talking about what does romantic and platonic even mean?
Oh, that simple task to
we're going to try our best.
Yeah.
Create antimatter and also define romantic love.
Yeah, easy. We'll do the easy one first and then the harder one second.
Okay.
Exactly. All right. Okay, so romantic love, the definition from Wikipedia is an emotional feeling of love for or a strong attraction towards another person, and the courtship behaviors undertaken by an individual to express those overall feelings and resultant emotions. That was convoluted.
Okay.
Wikipedia, but
Wikipedia.
nice try.
Okay.
I like how clinical Wikipedia is.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's pull this one. This is from Collins Dictionary. An intensity and idealization of a love relationship in which the other is imbued with extraordinary virtue, beauty, etc., so that the relationship overrides all other considerations, including material ones. Wow, what an extreme image that paints.
Right?
Goodness.
Not wholly inaccurate of how we conceptualize romantic relationships in our culture, but wow.
Yeah. The third definition we pulled here was from a 2021 biological look at romantic love by Bode and Kushnick. And it said, romantic love is a motivational state typically associated with a desire for long-term mating with a particular individual.
I feel like none of these definitions are exactly it, really. So they also had a hard time, and maybe they found antimatter to be easier.
Well, so that's that's what I wanted us to discuss for a moment here is, this is just 3 definitions and there are lots out there, but all of them have this really hard time or can seem so different from each other, like these 3 are. And yet you always kind of read them and go, I don't know if that's quite it. But it's like,
yeah.
But is that the problem? Is it that the definition's wrong? Or is it that we maybe use romance to describe all sorts of different things at different times and it doesn't even have a consistent definition?
Yeah. So to dive into the history of the word itself for romance or romantic, it comes from French, which morphed its way into Old English. It originally referred to verse poems, which are basically adventurous stories that were told in verse. And there's the modern French word roman, which means novel, also comes from the same root word. And so originally they were adventure stories told in verse, but in the 17th century, the stories started to include love stories. And so the word became associated with those emotions, qualities, and actions.
Right. And specifically love stories of the chivalric knights and that whole world that involves a lot of possessiveness or even obsessiveness with this person that you're just so taken with that you'll sacrifice everything for them. And that type of kind of losing oneself, I guess, in the romance was characteristic of that chivalric kind of love story that romance originally was describing, because it was about those stories. And so while romance first was describing the stories, then it described kind of the actions, which is that the sort of the courtship and that possessiveness and obsessiveness. And I thought this was interesting because if we go back to that definition that we looked at before, the one that Dedeker read from Collins Dictionary, that talks about the other person being imbued with extraordinary virtue or beauty so that the relationship overrides all other considerations, including material ones. It's
so weird.
Yeah, I could see that fitting with this kind of original concept of where romance came from. And then the Wikipedia definition talking about, it describes these strong feelings of attraction to someone, but also describes the courtship behaviors undertaken to express those feelings and the emotions one has because of those feelings. It's yeah, that does seem connected to this idea that it's about these stories of these adventures and these nights that have love involved, and kind of what would be going on there actually kind of fits with that.
I also heard once upon a time that another marker of this chivalric romance story was that, the object of affection was somebody who may have already been married and someone that you couldn't even have sex with or hope to actually be with. And that was something that made it even more chivalrous and romantic, that it's you still felt so intensely for them despite all that, despite knowing that you wouldn't be able to have sex with them or marry them or whatever, but you still went out of your way and stopped at nothing to profess your love or sacrifice things for them.
Interesting.
So what you're saying is that your will chooses me, but your heart chooses him.
Something like that. I was thinking maybe I'll do anything for love, but in parentheses, but not that.
But I won't do that. Yeah, okay.
See, I think the real definition of love is going to be specific to each person, and it'll end up in a beat poetry type of sense. It'll be trust, communication. I don't know. Excitement, happiness, something like that, and that's it.
I do just have to give a call out to Carrie Jenkins, who we had on the show many, many years ago, and her book, What Love Is and What It Could Be. Highly recommend people go check that out, because that's also looking at the history of our notions of romantic love, looking at it through a philosopher's lens.
Right. And so I think the other thing to come back to with this is that we're not talking about what is love. Don't hurt me. What we're talking about is what's romantic love specifically. When we talk about a romantic relationship or romance, what are we even talking about?
I do wonder if romantic love kind of devolves, or not devolves, but evolves rather into something else, like committed love, or, romantic love. To me, sometimes I associate that with more of the NRE or courtship stage of a relationship, and then it becomes something else as time goes on, potentially.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, there's definitely people who study, forms of love who that's kind of the specific thing that they study is kind of the evolution or the progress through different sorts of love, or maybe the distinctions between different types. But I think the reason why romance and romantic love is worth spending some time talking about is because so often we use it as, we can talk about all these different forms of love and different types of attraction, but we kind of define relationships into one of two categories. They're either romantic or they're platonic. And that, when you really look at the definitions and how they're used, and if you ask people for their definition of it, you're going to get a bunch of different definitions that are neither of those are are large enough to be, these are the only two categories. And yet that is still how we categorize relationships. And I don't think that's in itself a bad thing. I think it's useful to kind of have a way to distinguish them, but I think it's worth getting some clarity on what we mean by these distinctions. What is romantic? One of the other things to note about romantic love is that I came across things from several anthropologists who over the years study cultures that were not completely taken over by European culture, like so many have been, and that they stated that in a lot of those cultures, they lack the same sense of romance as we know it, that we kind of take it for granted. It's either romantic or it's platonic, but that their romance might not include the same feelings of monogamy and jealousy and exclusiveness and possessiveness and those things that we associate with romance, largely because of it growing out of this chivalric sort of way of thinking. So I thought that was pretty interesting too.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Wow. I'm I want to know more about those other cultures and what we can take from them in our own view of love over here in the West.
Right.
Yeah. Alrighty. Let's talk now about platonic love. So we're going to throw some more definitions at you. The first one is from Merriam-Webster Dictionary. It is love conceived by Plato as ascending from passion for the individual to contemplation of the universal and ideal. What? What?
As love that ascends from passion for an individual to contemplation of the universal and the ideal.
So it's like your gateway to the doors being blown off your reality and just having a total stoner whoa moment about the whole
That's
universe.
Platonic. Oh, really? Oh, because it's like a Plato thing as opposed to the word Platonic. Is that what it's getting at?
Well, that's where the word comes from.
That's where the word comes
Plato's
from.
Yeah,
name.
Plato,
Yeah.
Platonic. Got it.
Right.
But Plato's rocking your freaking world, is what you're saying.
Right. You're transcending passion for one person to just contemplation of the universe and truth and things like that.
I mean, that echoes some sentiments I've heard in some more new agey hippy dippy spaces around romantic love, and also around specifically non-monogamous love as well. The idea that this love is kind of the gateway or the pathway that opens us up to this deeper love of the entire universe or of all beings, that it helps us tap into that in some way.
Sounds like you're on MDMA.
I mean, I think that's the shortcut for a lot of people, but sure.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, super far out. Very cool. The second definition from Merriam-Webster is a close relationship between two persons in which sexual desire is non-existent or has been suppressed or sublimated. That's interesting.
Yeah. Sorry,
I don't know
Dedeker,
if I
you
would...
looked like you were going to say something.
It's interesting that they got those flavors in there of suppressed or sublimated as well.
I know.
Yeah.
Because that almost makes it sound like the people kind of want to, but we're not going to.
Or we want to, but we're deciding this is going to be firmly platonic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that is a really interesting distinction. As I was learning more about sort of the history and usage and definitions, was that is part of what Platonic means. And actually, in a lot of the usage, it was used specifically to describe relationships between heterosexual opposite sex people who, by all accounts, should want to do it, but either don't have that desire or very often are intentionally suppressing that, which kind of brings us back to what you were talking about, Dedeker, with the chivalric love of the kind of, I feel this, but I can't do that, so I'm suppressing it or maybe sublimating it into some other thing like loyalty to Guinevere or
jousting
or something like
that's where
that.
I'm putting all my sexual pent up sexual frustration.
I mean, it makes sense.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm saying like we all know how that turned out. Like she ended up kissing him, and yikes, that didn't end up well. But not that has to happen for everyone. They could have remained friends, and that could have been it.
Right.
I have to clarify. That's how it went down in the 1995 film First Night, starring Richard Gere, Sean Connery, and Julia Ormond.
Love her.
That was their telling of the story.
Yes.
Not that actually happened, but all right, let's talk about this real quick. Plato never used the term Platonic love or talked about it as such. Rather, the term has kind of grown out of this idea that the highest form of love is a love of divinity and for the conceptual ideas of the universe, rather than just this interpersonal sexual love. That's kind of interesting because I do think, and I don't necessarily want to conflate it with like religion, but when I hear people talking about religion or a higher being, they're like, that comes first, like above even my love of my spouse or my kids, for example. I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but it's fascinating.
I mean, it feels connected to me in a lot of cultures and schools of thought. There's still this very sticky, persistent idea of we put things connected to the body and the needs of the body at the bottom of the ladder, and then we put things connected to the mind or our sense of spirituality or a sense of, connection to the universe at the top of the ladder. And that shows up everywhere from Christianity to, things even like the chakras, right? It's like your root chakra is like in your pelvis, like right in your crotch there. And that's like the lowest one versus your crown chakra, which is like your super spiritual. And that's like your highest one. And so this is a theme that shows up a lot.
Mm-hmm.
If you're doing a downward dog, it becomes the highest one, your root chakra.
True.
That's good.
True.
Or if you're in an inversion.
There's a lot of positions where your root chakra becomes the highest one, if you know what I mean.
Hey-o.
Yeah, quite. Indeed. So Plato did describe the levels of love as a ladder, just like you were talking about with this sexual lust at the bottom. And then as you move up, you stop paying attention to the physical form at all. And then you just like move towards love of divinity and being one with the universe, basically. How beautiful. I don't know. Again, it sounds like he was on a lot of drugs. Like, good for him. Like, have some fun, but fascinating. I don't know. I feel like I'm a little more like grounded on my interpersonal relationships rather than my oneness with the universe.
I do think it's interesting, though, that if we took this term from Plato talking about love, it seems like the way we use it is completely not referring to that at all. And so it is kind of weird how this one, even more so than the other romance or the other love, the romantic love we talked about, is even farther from kind of where it originally came out of, at least in how we use it today.
That's true.
Now, here's an interesting definition of Platonic love from Britannica. So, quote, in common speech, Platonic love means a supremely affectionate relationship between human beings in which sexual intercourse is neither desired nor practiced. In this sense, it most often refers to a heterosexual relationship. So like Jace was saying. And by extension, it may be used to cover that stage of chivalrous or courtly love in which sexual intercourse is indefinitely postponed. From the Renaissance to the end of the 19th century, the term Platonic love was also used as an occasional euphemism for homosexual love in view of the comparatively tolerant attitude to such love discernible in Plato as well as in other Greek authors.
Fascinating.
Right. So, the whole thing about finding like my other half or whatever, that idea that it comes from this story from Plato's Symposium, I think was the one that came from. The idea that humans were originally these beings that shared one body and had two sets of legs and two arms and two faces looking opposite directions, and that at some point we were split apart And so we're kind of on this eternal quest to find our other half. That in that story, he specifically says, and there were 3 types of these beings. There were the ones that were 2 males, male, female, and 2 females. And so that idea of maybe platonic love also referring to how they were much more kind of accepting of that than people were in the 19th century.
Oh, it's like that Hedwig song.
Yeah.
Which one?
Yes. Yeah, The Origin of Love. It's basically that, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's telling the same story. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Interesting. But again, the sexual intercourse thing is the one that kind of differentiates it. I guess that makes sense, but it leaves out people who are asexual, for example, or a variety of other things. So I don't know.
And
I wonder if that's like the only thing that creates the differentiation there.
And that's the weird, interesting part when I was trying to get to the bottom of this, where I was like, okay, generally speaking, when we think of romantic relationship or like a romance novel or a romance book, it's that you have 2 people who want to have sex with each other and also feel affectionate toward each other and probably want to keep having sex with each other for a long time. That's kind of like, those are the defining traits we think of for that. And maybe possessiveness too, or monogamy or something. And then when we think platonic, we think close relationship, but no sex, whether that's because you don't want it or you just can't do it. But either way, that's platonic. But then it is this weird thing of like, if we're trying to imagine that these are defining traits of love, and then you say, okay, well, what if you took sex out entirely? Are they still different from each other? And I was hoping to get to sort of the bottom of what that might be. And it all sort of falls apart. Because it does seem like that's kind of the only difference. And I don't think it really is in how we talk about it. Like there's other sort of romantic gestures and things like, holding hands or kissing or whatever. But again,
some friends do that,
some friends do that, and some cultures do that more than others. And so it's just weird to me that we have these 2 categories that we talk about as if like these are the 2 categories. And yet, even they don't hold up to much scrutiny,
Yeah, I did an interview recently on Australian radio about, it was a very like polyamory 101 style interview. And, like all the typical stuff. It's like you get to the point of answering those same questions over and over. Like, I feel like I could do it in my sleep at this point. But I mean, that same argument where you're trying to point out to people like, hey, you manage having multiple close friends, you manage having multiple close family members, you manage having multiple children. Like, it's all the same skills really being pulled on. And one of the hosts was like, I'm not going to do a terrible Australian accent as much as I would love to. I can't.
Sorry. I'm just sorry for all of our Australian listeners. So sorry.
It's just going to be bad. Or... No, I can't. No, I'm not even going to do it. Okay. Only behind closed doors for that one. No, but one of the hosts was asking, but the intimacy, there's intimacy that like makes that different. And I did try to push him on that of like, okay, by intimacy, do you just mean sex?
Right.
Like, do you just mean that it's sex is the only thing that makes your like relationship with your wife at all any different from your relationship with your best friend? And he's like, oh, well, no, like not just sex, but also couldn't quite put into words what it actually was. And so it is that weird thing where on the one hand, I think, again, we're trained to think in this binary of sexual relationship, non-sexual relationship. And we also know that just because sex is happening does not mean that there's romance happening or love happening or actual partnership happening. And it's like a very incomplete discussion on these things.
Yeah, and I think it's, again, in our society and Western culture and society here in America, especially, we place so much, I guess, on the sexual romantic relationship and the possibility of marriage and all of that because they're the people that get all the tax breaks and, it's seen as the highest form of what human beings can accomplish in a unit, I guess, to a lot of people. Like, this is the pinnacle, this is the thing that we're all striving for, and it's that's challenging, I think, at times, because it discounts the other types of relationships that we can have in our lives.
Yeah. And something we'll get into more in the second half of this episode, too, is how it also kind of, the way we talk about them sets up this kind of hierarchy where it's like, yeah, platonic relationships are cool and all, but like the ultimate one's romance, which is why we say things like, oh, well, this is less than romance, but more than platonic or something like that. We're kind of unconsciously setting up this hierarchy of romantic ones. Basically, the relationships where you fuck each other are somehow more important, or they're higher or better or more desirable or something like that. So it's just interesting how baked into all of our language and all of our culture that is. And we're going to talk about some terms that are challenging that right after we take a quick break to talk about some of our sponsors for this show. If you could take a moment to check them out, it helps us to keep this show going and keep it coming to all of y'all out there for free.
There's still a lot of uncertainty in the world, but if you want a bit of an escape, then you should be using our wonderful sponsor for this week, Dipsea, because you can enter into a world where good, fun, clean, exciting play happens, and you can let yourself get carried away.
But don't get us wrong, it's not always clean, wink.
That's true.
You know what I mean?
That's true. It can be whatever you want it to be, quite frankly.
Dipsea is an audio app full of short, sexy stories designed to turn you on. Each Dipsea audio story features characters that are written to feel like real people and immersive scenarios so that you feel like you're right there. I know I've been using the app for quite a while now. I really, really appreciate that in their stories, they prioritize safe sex and consent, and not in a weird, stilted after-school PSA kind of way, actually in a very, very sexy way.
For listeners of the show, Dipsea is offering an extended 30-day free trial when you go to dipseastories.com/multi. That's 30 days of full access for free when you go to DIPSEA stories.com/multi. dipseastories.com/multi.
I just saw this morning that Google searches for just the term, quote unquote, dating is at an all-time 5-year high.
Whoa.
Wow.
People are ready. People are ready to date and to mate and to procreate. Maybe. I don't know.
Gosh.
At
Anyway,
least
we're
meet
going to
new
help
people.
you out. We're going to help you out. You don't have to go to Google and sort through all the search results. You can go and use our sponsor, Field.
Yeah, Field is the alternative dating app for couples and singles who don't adhere to just the traditional idea that I'm looking for the one that I want to be with forever. This is for people who are honest, ethical people who want to express who they are, what they want, regardless of your gender or your orientation. You can choose from over 20 different genders and sexualities right in the app. You don't have to press other and type your own thing. They're just built right into the app. And it values sex positivity and encourages you to share your desires and interests directly on your profile so that you can connect with other open-minded people.
And here's some great news. You can download the Field app for free and support our show by using the link in this episode's description. So click the link in our episode's description to get the Field app today for free, or go to multiamory.com/field. That's FEELD.
Hey, Multiamory listeners. We believe that regardless of what relationship style you're in, you should have access to content that acknowledges you, affirms you, and includes you. And we also think that that information should be freely available.
There's a trend that's going on right now, you may have noticed with podcasts, that a lot of them are starting to move behind paywalls. Some of the big companies are trying to monetize podcasts by making you pay to listen to them at all, or to hear more than one episode of them. But it's really important for us to be able to offer this show to everyone out there for free, and to be able to offer things like listener hangouts and stuff like that. And the main way that we've been able to do that so far is from the contributions of our Patreon community.
That's right. Our Patreon community is really what keeps this show going. And it also is a way that we can give back to you. We have a private Facebook group. We have Discord communities. And we can also give you things through Patreon, like early releases, things like bonus episodes. We have regular video discussion groups, which are really, really incredible every single month. We have so many amazing people from all over the world joining them. And it's just a lovely way to interact with our community. And also sometimes we're going to throw you some free merch. And isn't that cool? I love free merch. So if this show has brought you value, if you love the fact that it's coming to you for free, it's giving people out there some great information on relationships, regardless of what sort of relationship configuration you're in. And if you want to interact with our amazing community, then go to patreon.com/multiamory and join us. We would love to have you, and we really, really appreciate the support.
Welcome back. We are going to dive right into talking about the term queer platonic. So, this is all new language that we're talking about here, literally coined in the last 2 decades or less, I would say. So queer platonic relationship, or sometimes shortened to QPR, that was first coined on specifically December 24th, 2010. It showed up in an online thread called Kaz's Scribblings. And clearly it filled a need that was there because the term caught on and spread throughout the queer community.
Like wildfire.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So it came out of the need for a term to describe the desire for an aromantic relationship that was not strictly defined into one of the 2 categories that we were just talking about, romantic or platonic. And being part of the queer community and having queer in the name is because part of what defines a queer platonic relationship is that it doesn't necessarily abide by traditional heteronormative rules. It can bend them. It can exist outside of what is, quote unquote, normally accepted in platonic relationships.
Yeah. And I think that's the key there. And because I've struggled with this term in the past when I've heard it, where I'm just sort of like, I can't quite parse it. I'm like, queer platonic, like what does it mean? And I think that makes sense when you kind of get more into queer, meaning specifically that it's not fitting into the conventions. And so it's like it's platonic, but it's queer. So it's outside of that. It's different than that. It can have different things than that, I guess, is how it makes sense in my head, at least, of like why this term is the term that's been used for it. There are other terms that have been used over the years. They all tend to share similar letters, but other variations are quasi-platonic, quirky platonic, or just Q-platonic with a capital Q. And it does tend to, though, involve deep, long-lasting relationships. It's kind of a core relationship or a very serious relationship. Not always. That tends to be what goes along with queer platonic. And the thing about it is being queer, meaning it's sort of outside of categorization in some ways, because it doesn't need to abide by the rules of either being romantic or being platonic, there's a lot of room inside of that category. So there could be sex involved. There could be romantic gestures like holding hands or kissing. But generally speaking, those are not as much like defining parts of the relationship as they would be in, say, a romantic relationship or one that people would define as romantic. And I thought that was interesting because that ties in with this relationship anarchy idea that we've talked about before on the show. It's been a little while since we've talked about relationship anarchy too much. But basically this idea that in society, it tends to be, okay, we're dating, like we're in a romantic relationship. And so therefore, we've adopted this whole set of expectations of here's the things that I expect that we will do and that everyone else will expect that we do because we're in a relationship we call a romantic one. Like have sex, kiss each other, potentially want to live together, lots of things like that, right? That just kind of come pre-packaged. It's like a prefix menu at the restaurant, right? You can maybe customize it a little bit, like which entree do you want or which dessert, but it's still going to follow pretty much the same shape, right? And then on the other hand, if you're platonic and you say, we have a platonic relationship, there's similarly a list of kind of unspoken expectations of this is what will be in that, and then also this is what will not be in it, mostly sex, right? That will not be in it. And so this idea
I'll
of
do anything
Queerplatonic,
for platonic friendship,
yeah,
but not that.
But not that.
I won't do that because it's out of bounds. That's not in the contract. And so in a queer platonic relationship, you might decide to raise kids together or buy a house together or plan your lives together. Things that normally we think of only happening in a romantic relationship, those could still happen in a queer platonic relationship.
Yeah, essentially, this term is kind of outside of the boxes that platonic and romantic relationships sort of are set in, what we would describe them as being. And, maybe just off the top of our head, when we think of platonic versus romantic, those boxes are kind of set up. They're prepackaged, like Jace was saying. But yeah, this queer platonic identity or what this kind of relationship is, it's ultimately for the people involved to kind of decide, like, hey, we're going to be the ones setting the terms and deciding what's right for us in terms of what this relationship is going to look like. It does, again, remind me of Carrie Jenkins' book. And yeah, just that decision making about like what love is and what it can be, like what this type of relationship is and what it can be. So it doesn't necessarily need to adhere to a particular model of how the relationship should look, which is pretty cool. And just a side note, it's important to understand that this term was created by and for the queer community. So it can feel appropriative or inappropriate for straight cis people to use it to describe their relationships. However, we're about to talk about another term. Our next term is going to maybe be for you if this feels similar to how you would describe a relationship in your life, but you do happen to be cis or straight or straight.
And that leads us to our next term, which is alterous attraction. So this is the definition pulled straight from the LGBTA wiki. Quote, alterous attraction is a form of emotional attraction. It describes a feeling that is not necessarily platonic, but also is not romantic in nature. For some, it may be in between romantic and platonic attraction, and for others, it may be completely separate from the romantic-platonic distinction. So this term, alterous attraction, was introduced around 2015, but there isn't really a clear original source. Usually whenever you speak that into the universe, inevitably there's someone who comes to the surface being like, I made that.
Me.
Yeah. It was me.
And they're usually a little angry about it.
Yeah.
It was me all along.
Sorry.
It's a me. So, and of course, while this term mostly describes the same concepts as queer platonic relationships, it's okay for anyone to use just to describe themselves or others. It's not specifically tied to the relationship or to the participants being queer, although it did also come out of that community, just like the term, queer platonic relationships did.
Yeah, and it describes that same thing, right? Of that pull toward emotional closeness or intense feelings for another person that don't feel strictly platonic, but they're also not romantic, which generally this tends to go along with the asexual, aromantic, ace spectrum of things, where it's kind of like, well, usually it's because, well, I don't want to have sex with this person, or maybe that's just not a significant part. It doesn't have to just be that, but that tends to be where both of these terms come in, is relationships where sex is not kind of the driving factor in that relationship, as it often is with something we would think of as just a normal romantic relationship. Now, even in trying to describe it, it's kind of hard to avoid saying things like, well, it's like a relationship that's more than platonic, but not quite romantic. Almost setting it up as if it's between, and that platonic is less than, right? And romantic is more than. And it's hard to avoid that temptation, but there has been a push to really intentionally move away from descriptions like that, because that implies this hierarchy where romance is still somehow the best or the most, and that platonic is somehow weaker than that, and that this is sort of medium strength.
I appreciate that it's a different word entirely from romantic or platonic.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
It takes the ideas of what those two relationships are kind of out of the picture, which is cool.
Yeah. Now, something caution is that your autocorrect may try to change it into adulterous relationship instead of alterous.
No.
Just be aware.
No.
Be aware your autocorrect may have a hard time with it.
That's funny. Amazing.
Yeah. I looked and I could not find an origin of the word alterous. I think that it is entirely 100% this is the meaning. This is where it came from. I don't know if it comes from alt, as in like alternative, perhaps. I'm not sure. But when you try to look up like definition or origin, all of it's just queer blogs and sites talking about alterous attraction and alterous relationships. So I thought that was interesting. If anyone out there is a linguist and you actually do know something more about the roots of this, hit me up. Let me know, because I've been really curious about this while I was researching this episode. So anyway, yeah, to go back to this idea of moving away from talking about it being, more than platonic or less than romantic. And that's that, many people, including us, prefer to think of it as being just something different, that it's a different type of relationship rather than being less than or more than. And as we got into earlier, even the terms romantic and platonic may carry some connotations that you don't even intend to put into those when you're describing them. So just kind of, I don't know, it points out some weaknesses in our language for sure. And going along with that is that the aromantic community has worked very hard to combat the stigma of platonic, meaning just friends, in that kind of negative or less than. It's just that, like wish it could be more, but it's just this, as in that's lacking somehow. So really trying to get away from that way of thinking about it. And so that's why I like having these other words to use to just sort of point out the fact that there's a lot more variation here than our normal ways of talking do. And we struggle with that on this show, I think. Like I often find myself trying to sort of describe how something could apply in a romantic relationship and also in platonic relationships. And in the back of my head, I'm always going, but what am I really trying to say? Like, do I need to clarify that?
Yeah, they're similar.
But if I just say relationships, people assume romantic relationships. And so it gets into this weird thing of like, how do I communicate in a way that's as accurate as possible, but also understandable to people, which is ultimately the purpose of language, right?
Yeah. I appreciate having these terms because I also struggle in my own personal life and over the course of my own personal history of having such a wide variety of relationships, a lot of which fall into this space, where often for me, it's been like, well, what counts as having a partner at a certain point?
Yeah.
How many partners do I have? Does this person count? Even though I like almost never see them. And we stopped having sex years ago, but there's still a lot of love there. Like, I don't know. And so I do think that clearly there's very much a need for a lot of people to be able to attach some kind of word or label to this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk about the comparisons and the contrasting elements of both of these terms. So Alterous love and queer platonic love, or queer platonic relationships. And both of these terms describe non-romantic relationships. They were both coined by the queer community. And both terms can be used for people having a sexual relationship, but not necessarily. And some people use them interchangeably, but others think that they're different. I don't really know. They sound pretty similar to me. But maybe they're different.
This is a hot topic of debate on forums sometimes.
Honestly, within this community, like anyone who's outside the mainstream, if it comes to debating a label, it's
we love it. We're all over it.
It's low-hanging fruit.
Sure.
Yeah.
Indeed. And also Alterous, as we said before, it can be used by and for anyone, but queer platonic should generally be reserved for people who identify as queer and whose relationships are queer.
And some people tend to associate the term queer platonic relationship with being a very core or long-term partnership that is non-romantic. And while alterous attraction tends to include more casual forms of attraction, of course, as you'll see from all the internet debates, that's not always true. And, just like romantic and sexual and platonic relationships can have a wide range of enmeshment and commitment, so can queer platonic relationships and alterous ones as well. And both of these concepts are very much connected to a lot of the concepts that are attached to relationship anarchy, where the terms of a relationship are decided by the people involved based on the specifics of what those people need and their connection, rather than taking on a whole set of expectations and limitations by default, like we do when we fall into these default categories of like, oh, we're going to call this a romantic relationship or we're going to call this a platonic relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I really enjoyed both exploring queer platonic relationship and alterous relationships as terms, but also just getting a little deeper into romantic and platonic as their own labels with their own histories and baggage and all that stuff. They're just like us. They have histories and baggage.
Indeed. Most things do.
Yeah. But I think both these terms are really important to know because at the very least, they help illustrate the range of important relationships that we can have with people and how different these can be. And I really like that they go against this stigma and stereotype that we're somehow less valuable or less deserving of love or less mature if we don't have a romantic relationship. And I really like that this is kind of just saying like, hey, what if we stopped even thinking about it in that kind of a binary way, right? And tried as a step toward moving away from that, which we've talked about many times on this show, this whole, these incorrect assumptions about how people who are not in a romantic or sexual relationship actually feel or actually identify, or their success or their responsibility or all those things, that we've just got so much baggage that we put on that that's not based in anything true. And it's really sad and unfortunate. So I like that this is at least a step outside of that.
Absolutely. And we are going to leave you with a quote from Sharonda J. Brown from whereyourvoicemag.com. I really like this quote. When we don't recognize the true value, efficacy, and gravity of non-romantic relationships like those in our real lives, it leaves too many people forcing themselves into romantic entanglements that were never meant to be. A trap that I fell into before understanding and accepting my A-spec identity. Affirming that I have always had the capacity to experience love in abundance and in valid ways that come naturally and feel right to me. To be able to challenge the narrative that I would be eternally empty, unwanted, and without purpose living a life unencumbered by romance was necessary for me to find a better way of loving myself.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
It's really beautiful.
I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I found that quote to be really moving. Because even though I don't identify as being aromantic or asexual, that concept of how often I've felt strongly about a person and either tried to make that into a romantic relationship when really that wasn't the right fit for us, or limited or restricted myself from something because it's like, oh, it's platonic, so it can't be that serious. And just to be free from that, boy, if I could go back in time, it'd be a nice thing.
If I could turn.
That's what I was going to say. If you could find a way,
Cher.
Jace.
Yeah.
If it's Cher, so yeah.
There's been a lot of
gotta go to karaoke now.
musical references in this episode. I'm into that.
Anything like love related, that makes a lot of sense.
True.
That's what all loves. That's what most songs are about.
Yeah. All right. So for our bonus for this episode, we're going to be talking a little bit about platonic marriages, a trend that perhaps is growing or perhaps has always been here and we're just now discovering it. And for our weekly question this week, we want to know, have you ever held yourself back from a relationship just because it was platonic, or invested yourself less in a relationship simply because it was platonic? We would love to hear from you. Also, if you want to talk about this episode, the best place to share your thoughts with other listeners is on this episode's discussion thread in our private Facebook group or Discord chat. You can get access to these groups and join our exclusive community by going to patreon.com/multiamory. In addition, you can share with us publicly on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. Multiamory is created and produced by Emily Matlack, Dedeker Winston, and me, Jace Lindgren. Our episodes are edited by Mauricio Balvanera. Our social media wizard is Will McMillan. Our production assistants are Rachel Shennework and Carson Collins. The researcher for this episode is M. Mays. Our theme song is Forms I Know I Did by Josh and Anand from the Fractal Cave EP. The full transcript is available on this episode's page on multiamory.com.